Hi everyone, welcome back. I hope you've had a nice break and we're hoping that our internet is stable. We're going to get right to it. I have Vanessa Laughlin and Gioia Gonzalez who will be here on hand live. And you should be seeing them right now. Hi ladies, nice to see you. We're going to go ahead. Their presentation is fantastic. It's Tools for Health, Wellbeing, and Resilience. We heard a little bit about resilience earlier with Dr. Andresek and some of the other speakers. So it's resilience before, during, and after COVID-19. So we're going to go to their recorded presentation, and Vanessa and Gioia will be answering your questions over the Q&A and chat. So go ahead and throw them in there, and then we'll come back live for a couple of questions of Q&A. Thanks, and let's roll tape.
Hello, thank you, and welcome to Tools for Health, Wellbeing, and Resilience before, during, and after COVID-19. Our team is presenting in partnership with the Whole Person Advocacy Integrating Mental Health Conference here in 2020. My name is Vanessa, and I'm the principal of Banister Advisors. We are a team of professionals who are dedicated to ensuring that complex client circumstances are addressed discreetly, efficiently, and appropriately. We help clients who are facing varied problems such as health crisis, critical diagnoses, into complex elder care, end of life, and even in bereavement after loss. We have offices in Seattle and Portland, and we work with clients all over the world in both employer-based benefits programs and direct private pay. I'd like to introduce you to two of my colleagues, Gioia Gonzalez and Gregory Whiting. Gregory, would you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Yes. Hello, my name is Gregory Whiting. I'm a proud navigator here at Banister Advisors. I'm a social worker licensed to practice in the state of Washington and California. And I also have a private practice for therapy.
Thank you, Gregory. Gioia?
Hi. It's so nice to be with this group today. I am also a licensed social worker. I am based out of our Portland office, and for the majority of my career, I have worked in hospitals and healthcare, so it is just really lovely to be with that group again of providers and patients and families and allied mental health providers, and to discuss such an important topic. So today we are going to touch on something really important, which spans from the way we talk about stress to how our bodies respond to that and impacts our behaviors to threatening situations, and to really understand and level set some of the terms we use around grief and loss and trauma and how that impacts all different communities that we are serving. This has been such a year just full of crises after crises, and we see you and the work that you are doing in your communities, and we really hope that our content today provides a shared way of talking about and learning to accept some of these trials that we're all facing. So again, this is what we're going to go through today. We're going to talk about how we are hardwired to manage stressful situations, how we have evolved from the beginning of time to be able to manage that. Again, how it impacts us behaviorally, and then how some of this manifests in the workplace. And how that can impact our productivity and creativity and relationships. So we'll talk about this spectrum of burnout that a lot of us have felt and feel. And then what makes us resilient? How are we able to come out of situations better and stronger communities, stronger personally and professionally, and what are some of the characteristics that it takes to obtain that? So I just wanted to start with this quote. We are quite naturally impatient in everything to reach the end without delay. We are impatient of being on the way to something unknown, something new, And yet it is the law of all progress that it is made by passing through some stage of instability, and that it may take a very long time. This really resonates with me in all phases of my lifetime where I have dealt with crisis, illness, and especially now. And the part that I really want to stick with you today, and what Gregory and I are what we hope to instill is this idea of the necessity of passing through. There is really no other way around what we are dealing with. You can't go over it, under it, around it. It is this passing through with acceptance and self-compassion and empathy to each other. And this knowledge that we are going to share today is informed by years of practice in healthcare that Gregory and I share. We have been in the trenches with probably many of you, and we have maybe shared jobs in similar locations. And so I want you to know that we understand what it's like to very intimately sit with people who are really struggling. And we do that compassionately, and compassion really means to suffer along with. So we will talk about resilience and how to get out of these situations stronger, but we have to pass through them first. So, this is probably not going to come as a surprise to anybody, but let's just talk a little bit about anxiety and depression in general, and then what has happened with an onslaught of crises that we've experienced with the pandemic, with a racial reckoning, with an election year. There's a lot going on, and in the meantime, none of our own personal life crises have stopped. So our parents are aging, our children are struggling behaviorally, potentially by not being in school. Those who are at home, who have special needs, who need to be in school, are not. So there is all of that, the struggles that existed, without COVID are there. And that just significantly impacts everybody's mental health. So you can read through the numbers here. The crux of it is that it has increased. So now more than half of people surveyed are exhibiting signs of depression and anxiety. I want to make really clear, though, that just because you might feel some of these things does not mean that you have a clinical diagnosis, or that patients that you might be advocating for have a clinical diagnosis. Depression and anxiety, as you may know, you need to meet a number of criteria within that's laid out by the DSM, and so that's going to look differently across every person. So today we're going to talk about how the neuroscience of stress and how some of that just manifests normally in a high stress situation. And I do want to stress that anxiety and depression are adaptive. We have adapted to be able to utilize anxious feelings and depressive feelings. So anxiety can sometimes be a great motivator when we're in times of stress. Depression can help us conserve energy for a future time when we're going to be when we need, to exert more energy. So anxiety and depression in and of themselves can be adaptive. It is when you meet that criteria of a certain number of symptoms over a certain amount of time, and when it's impacting your functioning is when you need to be seeking help. So I want to normalize that some of these symptoms, given the state of our world, is incredibly common. So again, we're going to get more in depth. A lot of these signs and symptoms of depression and anxiety match up really well with our responses to stress. But the main point here is that, they can really mimic a lot of other diagnoses. And I think in this time, while we're advocating for patients and families, as we are working up medical diagnoses, anxiety and depression need to be on a differential. So how are we talking to providers about these issues? How are we looking at the whole person in terms of the complexity of their whole life? So as social workers, we are grounded in a philosophy of person and context. And so we are always looking at the dynamic of the social structure they're living in, the country they might be immigrating from, the community they're currently living in, all of those job stress, unemployment, housing, all of these structures that can create disparity, right? So as we talk about what a person is dealing with in a medical office, we always just want to be aware that mental health should be considered when we're working up other medical diagnoses. Okay, so disorder versus survival, the evolution of our minds. So our ancestors survived because we were wired to worry first, then feel, and then problem solve. So our brains are built from the bottom up. And again, this is where anxiety and that stress response can be useful. It helped save us. It was very adaptive. And, you know, the better you became at anticipating and avoiding danger, the longer you lived and the more kids you had. And that is really what the body is trying to do, is to procreate and to live on through generation. And then next is the limbic system, which stores our memories. It's sort of the smoke detector of our brain. It sort of goes off when something is alerted to stress, and that's where we integrate a lot of memory and where the initial fear response comes from, and we'll get into that, fight, flight, fawn, and freeze. And Dr. Andrzejczyk earlier talked a lot about this in her talk. So it's really aligned with these ideas of trauma and these responses that we have that are really based in our survival. Yet they hijack the prefrontal cortex, which is the front part of our brain that really is not developed until our mid-20s. So any of you have teenagers out there, really shouldn't be expecting them to be able to be making adult level decisions until they're in their mid-20s. But it facilitates this higher level thinking, problem solving with nuance. And that is the part of the brain that is really not engaged during a time of very high stress. So again, stress is experienced as a threat to our bodies. And even though not all stress is traumatic, it's hard for the brain to know the difference. And so when we feel this flood of emotion, our working memory is going to shrink. It's going to make it harder for us to focus and retain new information. It's going to make us harder to attend to cues for safety that the brain may normally be aware of and really adapt at dealing with. And so it just makes everything harder. And a lot of people are really experiencing this in their work lives. I'm not retaining information as well. I'm not tracking as well. And that's, I would say, to some degree, is a stress response. So this can also manifest in fatigue, exhaustion, lack of concentration, inability to focus, irritability, and difficulty to sticking with routine, which is really unfortunate because we know that routine is a real central factor in stability and wellness and mental wellness. So I'm sure many of you have heard friends, family say, oh, that's gut-wrenching, or I'm heartbroken, or I'm sick to my stomach. And those phrases make a lot of sense when we're talking about a stress response to our bodies, because the nerves that run from the parts of our brains that manage, the limbic system that in our brainstem that manages our survival goes through our main organ systems as well. So racing heart, stomach upset, incredibly sweaty, those are physical symptoms that manifest when we are feeling like we are in this state of danger. So when someone is experiencing some of that, a lot of times people might think it's panic, an anxiety attack. And so learning these techniques around acceptance and mindfulness, there's so much evidence and how breath work can really calm down the central nervous system and re-engage the frontal lobe. That is why those building competency and really flexing that muscle and mindfulness is just an incredibly important way and a crucial way to oftentimes stop some of these symptoms. Again, these can be similar to other significant health diagnoses, other, medical ailments that should be worked out and a physician should be consulted for. But again, normal in the context of managing stress. So our first inclination when we're feeling flooded by, just fear and anxiety, there's so much uncertainty. Sometimes we don't even know where it's coming from. Our first inclination is really to get rid of it. And take a minute and look at this and see if any of these resonate. Has anyone been drinking more during COVID? Has anyone been, sort of addicted to the news, just sort of retreating into their phones to get away from whatever's swirling in their home? There's just so many things that we do in these stress responses to try to stay calm. And, I want to say that in situations when people are freezing and fawning, that is because a lot of the times fight and flight have not worked for them. So they go into these freezing and fawning until they are able to fight or flight. And so sometimes we will see this with sex assault, with interpersonal violence. And, it's important for us to recognize the behaviors of individuals in those situations so we can compassionately and, from a scientific perspective, understand the response is a stress response. It is a way for them to self-preserve in a traumatic experience. And so, yeah, I would like for everyone just to sort of take a moment here and have just sort of a reflection on what kinds of ways, if any of this resonates with you, and, if you want to contribute in the chat, if any of it resonates, or if you have questions about any of how this, of how you might be interfacing with it, please participate. But again, a lot of this also, in adulthood, we can regress to what was modeled in our childhoods as well. So in times of stress, we will often go back to the ways that we, to what was modeled or the way we were taught to manage stressful situations.
So Gioia, I have a question.
Okay, hi.
So I'm pretty familiar with fight or flight, but I feel like freeze and fawn, this is kind of new to me, and I imagine it might be new to some other people as well. Could you give a couple of other specific examples, maybe in the context of being with family or being in the workplace where freeze and fawn might manifest? And Gregory, as well, from your private practice, psychotherapy, if you have any quick examples as well, I think that'll help illustrate some of these concepts that are beyond fight or flight.
Yeah. Gregory, do you want to jump in here at all?
Yeah, provide some examples of what these things look like in the real world.
That'd be great, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm going to start with fawn because I've also heard it as being appeasing, fight, flight, freeze, appease. For those of you who need some kind of mnemonic or a way to remember it easily, oftentimes in human relationships, people who are used to appeasing as a way of getting by will fall back on that as a way to cope with like a high stress situation. And so, appeasing might work in maybe like a dominant sibling relationship where one sibling, just takes up a lot of space. But when you start getting into situations in which your safety is at risk or the conflict is higher, it doesn't quite sort out the major issue. So, the way this turns out is that, people can end up in relationships where they are enmeshed. I've unfortunately encountered that a lot with people where someone is doing harm to themselves or doing harm to their partner, and their partner has normalized the behavior so much that their response to it is to just encourage it or allow it. And, you know, that's part of going along to get along or going along with it. You know, there's no boundaries embedded in that. So I tell patients or clients that, you know, one of the most harmful aspects of that is not only the fact that you're kind of losing out to that conflict, but on a bigger scale, you're losing out on a sense of self or identity. So you don't want to lose yourself to the conflict that you're dealing with, or the conflict with people that you're dealing with. It's obviously, or maybe not obviously for people, it's even larger of a concern. It's a much greater concern when you're dealing with domestic violence or things that look like domestic violence. And if you have confusion about that, you can always look up a continuum of domestic violence. If you look that up online, you will find a lot of useful resources on identifying that in human relationships. And I can provide other examples if you all would like, if you'd like me to talk about fight, flight, or freeze.
Those are really helpful. Thanks, Gregory.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe one really quick for fight, especially when it manifests in a way that is not how people may classically think of it. I think that might be really interesting.
Yes. Okay. So I will switch over to medical social worker mode and talk about some of the experience I've had as a medical social worker. That's I've worked in the emergency department for many years. So that's, working in the emergency department is as if, every day is a day in the year 2020, right? There's always a crisis going on. There's a lot of problems to deal with. And you've got 20 or more patient rooms with all these things going on. And so, fight is, it's useful if you have a problem in which that's the only way you can get out. But all these examples we're using here, we're trying to explain that oftentimes these attempts to cope with problems are really a misapplication of these survival mechanisms. And so fighting, sometimes it involves arguing with the people who are trying to help you. So, arguing with the doctor, arguing with the therapist, arguing with the partner or family member that really wants to figure out what's going on. Sometimes it means arguing with yourself, so feeling bad about yourself. It can mean, taking charge when what you really need to do, instead of taking charge and trying to snap yourself out of it, is to actually just accept what you're feeling. What exactly are you fighting? What exactly are you resisting? Let's see, suppression. So, I think this can also be quite gendered. For those of you who are cisgender men and have been raised in cultures in which masculinity is defined as always having to be right or resilient or have the right answer or always be the last one in the room to lose your cool or to cry or anything like that, the fight response is coded as masculine and therefore appropriate for us as men. And the reality is that ends up hurting us, because if you look at all these different responses here, flight, freeze, fawn, all of those apply to different scenarios that we're dealing with. So if we force ourselves down that path of fight only, all of a sudden, we're in a situation in which we perceive ourselves to be a hammer, and therefore every problem to be a nail. And that's not really useful.
Gregory, this is so helpful. Thank you for those illustrations. All right, Joy, I think back to you. We can advance and keep going. Thank you, Gregory.
You're welcome.
Yeah, so this is just a little levity. So the physical response is real. So this is just, us having a little, this is true. It really, sometimes the things that the worry is sometimes often worse than what we are worrying about, and it impacts our health. So the ACEs study is a really good example of this, is that the health outcomes that are connected with some of these fears are very real, and it changes the way our bodies function. And so again, having an awareness about the cortisol that pumps through our systems when we are in this, when our amygdala is constantly scanning for threats, does have a damaging effect. And so the first step in sort of overcoming this is an awareness of it, is knowing that it's happening. So can bad stress be transformed to good stress? And you might be thinking, what is good stress? And I will challenge you with, what is bad stress? Because stress really, in its definition, is neutral. So imagine feeling capable of handling whatever life throws at you without having to panic, overreact, or plan an exit strategy. That would be nice, right? So if we think about stress as neutral, then distress and eustress, so bad stress and good stress, are the way we are framing it. So we are conditioned to think that all stress is negative, when really we know from the previous slides that it can actually be quite adaptive and and motivating, and can encourage us to get things done in certain circumstances. Now, 8 months into a pandemic, it's debilitating and quite harmful. So how do we take this distress that we are feeling, or how do we take stress in general and frame it into good stress? And so here are some different characteristics of bad stress and good stress, and how, from the previous slide, we know that the bad stress can create health risk, and we know that good stress can create health benefit. So putting this in context to the work you are doing, I don't like saying that certain communities are, Black and brown communities are disproportionately impacted by COVID. I think that our systems disproportionately care for them in a negative way. Those are systemic issues. So when we are specifically working with communities of color, how can we train, teach to, as advocates, some of these techniques of mitigating some of the health risk that is associated with bad stress, when we know they are going to interface with a system that is not going to treat them with equity. So again, good stress, it only lasts a short term. It tends to be more predictable. Again, this is really wrapped up into resilience, which Gregory's going to get into, and I want to make sure he has enough time to get into that. So keep this in the framework when he is talking about resilience, in terms of that the distress does not define who you are. It does not infiltrate every aspect of your life, and it doesn't predict your future. So if you can set those limits, you can train your mind around setting those limits around some of the distress and saying, where is the opportunity here for us to find some space to just hold the pain and move through it, and try to support each other, and create some emotional balance there, and again, re-engage that frontal cortex so we can think with nuance and problem solve when we're not so distracted. Again, it's all about calming that central nervous system so we can make decisions in a way that makes sense for us. And so like stress and distress, the way we define terms is important, and the way we talk about them with our patients and our clients is really important. And again, in our culture, we are taught to think that grief is something you do when someone dies. And the way that we define it is really that it is a process that you go through when there is a loss, any type of loss. And Hillary McBride is a PhD psychotherapist, author, who says grief is the presence of absence. It's the presence of absence. So what have you lost that has been meaningful to you that you need to grieve so to prevent trauma? Gabor Mate says, and I'm totally paraphrasing, that really trauma is the absence of being able to grieve. And you can Google that quote. It's beautiful. I just totally butchered it. But trauma occurs when we have not created space for people to heal and go through that process of that loss. So Material loss is something that is really experienced in young age. The classic example is a child walking along and the ice cream falls off the ice cream cone. That is a loss that matters to them. In COVID, there's been a ton of role losses, loss of job, forced retirements, functional loss. It just spans the lifespan here, and I can't stress just the actual loss of relationship, of death that we have experienced. And with any type of grief and loss, your body will experience that neurochemical cascade that floods your brain. And again, those same symptoms that we experience, fatigue, anxiety, depression, loss of appetite, disturbed sleep, are associated with grief. And so we want to make sure that we're supporting people in their grief in a meaningful way, in a culturally competent way that creates, again, space for them to do this well. There have been a lot of losses. So here I would encourage you to think about, in your family of origin, how you were taught to grieve, what that means, what grieving looks like. And if any of these, if this is new to you, if you have felt any of these types of losses throughout COVID, I mean, just intrapsychic loss, abandonment of plans. Like, everybody has lost the ability to plan for meaningful events in their lives. And so I'm guessing that resonates with the group here.
Gioia, thank you so much. I'd like to add just a couple comments here because of our work with clients where, we get to see all of these different types of, often overlapping types of loss. And it only builds in detail from here, whether it might be a role loss of someone whose spouse has died and they're trying to figure out, am I single again? What does that even mean to be widowed or widow? People, I love the example here of role loss with retirement. People celebrate retirement, but there can be grief with that transition. Material loss, let's say people downsize after their children move out and they decide to go into a smaller place. They have that material loss, which is, again, in some ways something to celebrate, but in other ways, it's hard to let go of that home they might have lived in because it doesn't meet their needs anymore. So I think, particularly with patient advocates, I think you're going to see with something like a chronic illness or a critical diagnosis, many of these often overlapping easily, all 6 of these and more, with something like a cancer diagnosis, right? So thank you for sharing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so I think we can move on for the sake of time. That was really nicely said. Okay, so those of us in healthcare, which is everybody in this audience, has heard some of these terms, I'm sure. This was actually created in the healthcare industry, this spectrum of workplace stress. And again, let's level set, right? Like, not everything is burnout. So the way that we talk to our staffs, to our colleagues about what they are experiencing, Gregory working in the ED, I did too for a very long time. There were lots of situations where Gregory, I'm sure you saw vicarious trauma playing out in terms of physicians making medical decisions, especially in some traumatic end of life types of situations. I really experienced like watching people's worldviews shift to a degree that impacts the way they deliver care. And so knowing what each one of these, how they manifest, and putting words to that, so sometimes if someone is saying, I'm not sleeping and I'm having trouble concentrating, and gosh, like, why can't people just get their act together and they wouldn't suffer so much? And this is a person who is in a caregiving role. You can say, like, you are emotionally and physically exhausted, and it sounds like you have some compassion fatigue, and this is compassion fatigue, right? And so if we are experiencing these things, the it is not our obligation to power through it and to continue to serve communities that need advocacy in a way where we are not full ourselves and whole ourselves. So again, recognizing how you are responding to stress. Who are you doing this work for? Asking yourself that question. And how do you feel in your body when you are doing the work? So all of these feelings about the job oftentimes will manifest in physical feelings, right? When you're watching someone do something in a healthcare setting that is not ethical, like I have been in that position where you are just waiting to speak up and you feel like puking. So again, it's acknowledging the feeling, knowing what is causing that, re-engaging doing some breath work, re-engaging the frontal lobe so you can interact in that environment. But again, this starts with understanding that in these times of stress and anxiety, it can really change the way we see the world and interact with our clientele.
Can I add something, Gioia?
Yeah, of course.
So one thing I'd like to add about this with burnout is that actually a few things. One is that all of us are dealing with workplace stress at the same time. So, you see one coworker at work and their posture is better than yours and their clothing doesn't have the same creases or wrinkles in it as yours. You've still got no idea what's going on internally for them. And so, when you speak up, the mere experience of saying, hey, something's not working right now, or I'm feeling tired, or I'm feeling overworked right now, or I need a break, that changes the whole fabric of the reality for the people that you're working with, or the people that you're in the presence of, that can hear you communicate or see your communication in group email, group chat, Zoom like this. You have maybe a 3-hour Zoom. You say, hey, can we take a break for a moment? Other people who might not be comfortable with doing that have now had the opportunity to see somebody model what it looks like to kind of take care of themselves. So, really don't underestimate your ability to kind of change the narrative. And the other thing I want to just add, about burnout and compassion fatigue is that, these things are not instant. They build up. It's not that the person who loses compassion or struggles to maintain it in their work has now reverted to the quote unquote bad person that they are or cruel person that they are. It's that it's been eroded, that they have not given themselves enough time to kind of charge up. And so, I was going to use the example of kind of walking up a hill, but I'll use a technological example. If you can consider yourself as, like cell phones or any kind of digital device that's powered by a battery, eventually, we'll think of a flashlight. Eventually, that light starts to fade. You're going to need to recharge those batteries or put new batteries in there. It is okay to acknowledge your human experience and to take a break.
Yeah, absolutely. And the more we are compassionate with ourselves, it actually increases our ability to feel empathy for other people. So it's sort of a prerequisite to be able to do this work really well and to show up. So I'm going to pass it off to Gregory now for the resilience slides.
Thank you. And one other thing I want to add about, workplace stress is that, oftentimes when you're dealing with stressful moments and, you want to say something and the idea comes up to you later, that doesn't mean that it's too late to get involved. You can still talk to staff about it or work on, setting up a policy or action to take on for similar situations in the future. Don't put the obligation of perfection on yourself as a roadblock or barrier to success with that. So let's move into looking at loss and resiliency. Loss is something that we have to accept to move towards resiliency. And honoring the loss, honoring the significance of it to us is something that is really important for us to build resiliency. We experience it across different continuums, and the process of going through grief is something where we really kind of accept the trauma of the loss and we allow ourselves to be changed by it. So you can see on the slide, it says, as we seek to heal from and reintegrate our grief. That means being able to live with what you're dealing with, not just ignoring it or pretending like it's not going on. We are collectively going through great loss in many forms. We are forced to find ways to live differently, ways to cope. We are brave, we are resilient, we support each other. Now, without looking at the person whose quote this is, unfortunately, it applies very much so to what we are dealing with right now in many different ways, whether we have lost family members, friends, people's health has just degraded, or their well-being has degraded, their ability to work has been lost, or their ability to learn, or to just experience the things that they currently have with joy. But loss and suffering is not something that the year 2020 has a stranglehold on. A lot of years have it. All kinds of years have loss for people. And Trudy James, a chaplain and HIV/AIDS activist, was talking about another pandemic that has had a very specific impact on a lot of people. And it's really important that we don't forget that, a lot of the suffering that we're dealing with now is in many ways not unique. We've had many pandemics in our society, but different people have been affected by them in different ways. During COVID, many of us are experiencing real loss, and understandably, we're anticipating loss. There are kids, I have friends with kids who've talked about the grief of not finishing their school year. I have friends with kids who have talked about the grief of not being able to celebrate birthdays. Some of my friends have talked about the grief of not only losing a family member, but the anticipatory grief that comes afterwards, where they know they can't visit their family and hug one another, or engage in the grief ritual that a lot of people do, where, when a family member passes away, people typically go back to that city or that home, and they're all living there together for a moment, and they're figuring out funeral arrangements. We're not able to have those traditions anymore. We have to create new traditions now. Identifying, all these losses, whether it's employment, housing, ability to care for a family, ability to enjoy the experience of family, identifying all those losses and naming where anxiety around those losses is coming from is the first step in managing it. It's the difference between looking at the problem as if, this whole day is terrible, and saying this moment right now is not agreeable. I'm not experiencing this moment the way I want to. To be able to have agency in what's going on, we've got to be able to accept and identify how we're feeling about it. That allows us to effectively create some boundaries with the problem. We've essentially got to name it to tame it. How we integrate these feelings and thoughts will likely determine if we are traumatized by the experience or if we're actually able to move through it. Can I get the next slide? Okay, post-traumatic growth. So I know people have probably heard about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but post-traumatic growth is something else that I think is very important. Basically, this is about figuring out how to go through trauma in a way where you can have success in your life and that trauma doesn't define how you live your life and what you do next. So this theory asserts that post-traumatic growth is the outcome of coping with the problems that we have, and it reflects the strength and resilience of humanity. There's two types of coping, as this outcome theory states. You've got homeostatic coping and you have transformational coping. Up top is the homeostatic. that is a restorative way of coping. It is a way in which we're able to return to healthy functioning without guaranteeing personal development. So that's kind of like not rocking the boat, trying to pretend like everything's fine, everything will be fine, and we will get right back to the way things were. And I'm imagining that some of you all are able to identify that as something you've already thought about or you've already wanted to move towards in terms of this pandemic. I've certainly heard a lot of people talk about it. I've thought about my life that way. When the pandemic is over, I can't wait to do this thing exactly the way I used to do it. Doesn't quite reflect the reality that we're living in. Transformational coping, on the other hand, is about having cognitive changes within our persona. So, when transformational coping is negative, a person is less likely or is more likely to succumb to stress. They're likely to revert to depression and worry. But if their transformational coping is positive, then they can have a surge of survival instincts, a higher level of recovery, increased inner strength, and sail through the adversity. So transformational clearly carries a risk, right? If you have like a negative coping response, the distress can overtake you. But if you're really looking at what you're going through and you're actually managing the issue and you're willing to confront what you're dealing with, then your coping allows you to basically be better because of what you're dealing with. Now, I'm not saying that the stress is a good thing, but it's an opportunity for growth. Thank you. So these are some ideas of what a resilient person is. You are under no obligation to personally check off every single thing on this list. Not now during this pandemic, and not even when this pandemic is over or under control or feels under control. These are just some great things to look at as some goals for being resilient. Also, it's different across different cultures. So I'll just read off a few that I really like that speak to me. Optimism is important, not in the sense that I have to have this false sense of security with everything that's going on around me, but optimism is important in the sense that I need to be able to perceive success. I need to be able to use my imagination to determine what success looks like. I need to be able to present myself as ready for success. So that's what optimism is for me. Patience is obviously quite important. Gioia already mentioned we are 8 months into this pandemic. I will bet this lovely sweater of mine that we will eventually be 9 months into the pandemic, right? We all know that this is going to be going on a lot longer than just a few more days, weeks, or months. Having a commitment to your goals is really important as a resilient person. Here we have past successes in the center column. That is important, but also having a sense of your past successes. So having a mindset in which you are able to see, accept, and learn from your past successes. I think that ties into the optimum piece. Viewing change as a challenge and opportunity. So that's the top part of the right column. That goes right back into post-traumatic growth for positive coping. If you're able to view your challenges or change as a challenge and an opportunity, then it becomes something that you can actively work with instead of succumb to. Recognition of limits to control. Shout out to the type A people in the room. Recognition of limits to control is really about making sure that you don't overwhelm yourself with the burden of thinking you have to have it all under control. And I'm joking about the type A people. I think people of all varieties want to have control over what's going on around them, especially when it's something that they're not enjoying or is providing them with a lot of trauma and stress. But I know it's really difficult for those of us who are used to being able to kind of have everything sorted out. Resilience is complex. As I've been talking, I'm sure you've all been able to look at some of these things and figure out how they apply to you or don't, or different cultural contexts in which they work. the process of being able to adapt well and bounce back in times of stress is not a linear pathway. Being resilient doesn't mean that you don't experience emotional pain or sadness. It's more of a commitment to a process that involves some stress and strain. It's a building process. It's likely to exist on a continuum where you've got different degrees of frustration and success, and it's likely to be different in different domains of your life. So you might find yourself being very resilient at home. You might have a home environment in which you feel like you have a lot of control or predictability, maybe a lot of support from other people in your household or friends or neighbors. You might not feel that way with work or with maybe hobbies that you engage in or other things that you've enjoyed outside of the home. So it's okay to feel like you are the check master and you can just run around checking off all these things in one aspect of your life and yet struggle in another one. It's quite human.
So I'm going to pipe up to just make a quick commentary and then ask for just real quick answers from both Gregory and Gioia so that I know, stay within the time. I will select out of this big list sense of humor and engaging the support of others in the form of my hobby right now is sharing hilarious memes from the internet with other people via text message. Gotta stay off social media. So directly sending it to people I care about is actually engaging the support of them by sending them something funny, laughing myself, and having a shared experience that way. And I just wanted to say that's what jumped out at me. Gioia, do you want to maybe share something quickly from your experience? And then Gregory, which ones you would pick up this resilience menu?
Yeah, I mean, I loved how Gregory talked about optimism being like using our imagination to reframe success. Like that was just so beautiful. And I think about my kids. My husband is a cancer survivor and they were so little when he was diagnosed and still are little. And that sort of combined with past successes and our faith, right? Like they will say, we can do hard things. So sometimes I think our past successes prepare us for future crises. And so I think that our family has reframed it in that way. We've been through something very hard and we can do this together. And our kids have sort of done what Gregory just, described in terms of reframing it in an optimistic sort of way. So I love that.
That's an excellent example, Gioia, and a beautiful one. I love always hearing about your family and the things you all are doing to make things work. I'm a big fan of Gioia and her family.
Likewise.
As well as Vanessa, I love hearing about both of your families, actually. I think one of my favorite resilience strategies, and I'm not sure where it would fit on here, but stress is received and experienced by people in really different ways. And so it's really exciting for me to look at a stressful situation and figure out where I'm effective and then really lean into it. So I went to visit a friend of mine in New Zealand. Wish I got lost there and stayed, to be honest, but that was 2 years ago, and he's terrible with directions. And he was just living there for a year. So we were driving across the country, and he didn't know how to get around. And I was pretty good at wayfinding. And so while he was feeling very anxious about it, I let him do the driving. I did the directing, and it made it so much easier because I didn't really feel too comfortable driving there because they were driving on the other side of the street, which just felt like danger. And I was very comfortable with figuring out directions. And so we just kind of swapped. We kind of figured out, what we were good at. And, I think resilience, maybe we've got, let's see, do we have creativity up here? No, we don't have creativity.
We should add creativity.
Yeah, I think resilience requires creativity. That's really important to me. One other thing that I do during this pandemic is I've started a newsletter. So I send it out as a part of my day job where I'm the director of equity and inclusion at a food bank in Seattle. And each week I send out a newsletter. 1 week is related to wellness and another one is related to equity and inclusion concerns. And I try and tie it into food access and to the pandemic. And I like writing, I like doing the research. So while everything we're dealing with is very stressful, I found a thing that I like to do that I'm effective at, that I can do to kind of share with other people. So let's go to the, oh, perfect, we're on the next slide. So opportunity and uncertainty. And you really can't get away from the optimism piece I was talking about, just looking at this title, right? Who looks at uncertainty and says, oh, this is a big opportunity? But really it is. Uncertainty has always existed. The future has never been certain. And, you know, maybe in a less dramatic way or in ways where the stakes were not as high. That's been true, you know, before COVID. But, you know, tomorrow has never really been promised for any of us, whether it's pre-COVID or during the COVID days. We've got a lot of tragedy and trauma that we deal with now that in many ways is highlighted or kind of emboldened in our minds and in our emotional ways of experiencing the world because we are living in a time of so much change. So the simple things are even more difficult. I cut my thumb cleaning a knife the other day and I had to go to the urgent care and all of a sudden I felt like I was in a Mad Max movie because I was like, I don't know if I want to go to the urgent care. How many people are going to be there? How bad is it going to be? I end up going right before they close. Nobody's there except for the staff. They've all sorted it out in terms of being clean and safe there. You know, and my thumb is fine. I can do everything. I can play video games still, you know. So, but the uncertainty was very scary for me. And, you know, in many ways, we've created a world and a culture in which we've been able to manage uncertainty and create certainty or security in the short term. And a lot of that really isn't available to us anymore in the same ways. You can't look forward to vacation time off in the same way because while you might have the time off, you cannot do the same trips that you want to. And so we've got to do some different things to really encourage this spirit of opportunity and uncertainty. One of the strategies is to focus on small wins. And when I say small, I don't mean things that are insignificant. I mean things that are still within the realm of control or access for you. For me, I was like, wow, I went to the urgent care. It was safe. I have insurance. My thumb is fine. I have housing. The people working at the urgent care were not overburdened where I live. These are all good things. Everybody had what they needed. I actually really appreciated that. It actually made me feel a lot better about where I was living as I'm dealing with this pandemic, because I could tell that emergency medical resources were not overburdened. Go back to your values. Direct your day towards behaving in a valued and connected way. This is kind of like getting back to your basics. Look at the things that have continued to serve you in your life, that have been helpful for you. Remind yourself of those things. For me, I do this goofy thing with my friends where every once in a while I will mail them something, or I will call them, and it's only for love. It's, you know, a plant I want to give them. It's a note I want to send them. It's a story about them that came to mind. I had a funny dream about a friend where he had an amazingly beautiful pool in his house. And I knew he was really busy, so I left him a voicemail about it. And he called me the next day and he was like, I want to hear all the details. So we talked about this wild dream that I had about him living in this beautiful house. For me, that's going back to my basics and my values, sharing my love, sharing my joy when I have it, especially.
Gregory, I love that story that you're sharing because it really brings it from the big and the scary down to the real and the personal. And yeah. I know you are an example of a resilient person, and you have to be to do the work that you do. So I just wanted to say thank you also for expressing your gratitude that comes through and just shines through as we wrap things up. And I want to thank Gioia as well for your great contributions, starting us off with a lot of the in-depth neuroscience, but this really, really makes it real. So I appreciate both of you sharing your personal stories. So I just want to say to everybody watching, we're going to be moving into Q&A for the questions that have been coming in, so we can answer those and respond to those live, as many as we can. And also anybody who wants to learn more about the Bullseye exercise, here we can also leave that up for now and talk about it in the Q&A as well. This is one of the takeaways that we'd like to gift to you as another tool in your arsenal for you and for the patients that you work with. So thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye.
Wasn't that amazing? Oh, Vanessa and Gioia and Gregory, who couldn't be here live with us, but that was just such a great workshop, and your authenticity and resilience of each one of you really shines through in that session. So thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. And I was wondering, we don't have a lot of time before we get to our next session, but could you briefly just describe that Bullseye exercise so when people go back and look at the slides, they know how to use that? Vanessa?
Yeah, I can go ahead and do that. Thank you all so much for your comments and chats. I wish we could chat all day. But so the Bullseye is based out of a modality called acceptance and commitment therapy that is about this sort of like metacognition, understanding your thought, like seeing your thoughts from above your thoughts, if that makes sense. So we're thinking beings, but we also have this observing self where we can be aware of what we're actually thinking, a sense of mindfulness. So that's really the first step, acknowledging what your thoughts are telling you and sort of checking them. And then the Bullseye exercise really weaves in and from acceptance and commitment therapy, this idea of leading from your values. And how do you, once you sort of check your thoughts, feel how it's feeling in your body, do that breath work, re-engage the frontal lobe, how do you lead from your values if you don't really know where you stand with your values? So the Bullseye exercise is an inventory and like some of the major domains in life. You can add financial, you can add religious domain, you can add whatever you want. But the ones there are just common domains in life. And the closer you get to the bullseye is indicates how close you are living to your values in that domain. So if it were work, if you're working a ton, it doesn't necessarily mean you should be on the bullseye. But if you're working the right amount in the right area, in the right industry, you're feeling like it's in line with your values, then the closer you are to the bullseye, the more in line with your values are. And it's an interesting exercise because it visually really lays it out there for you. And then you can say, wow, I'm really on the periphery with family relationships or with self-care. And then you can take action to evaluate why you value that and where you want to be, what you want the outcome to be, and then make decisions around that. So it's tied in to acceptance and commitment therapy. That's all really well explained in a book called The Happiness Trap. I highly recommend that. It'll give you a really core understanding.
And I'm assuming that folks who have questions about this exercise, Banister, you have kind of a unique advocacy model because it's kind of like whole person, birth to death kind of advocacy company. So if they want to know more about that, you're a partner member, you're going to be around to answer questions through Whova or beyond. Is that right?
And our exhibitor booth, Robin. So yeah, we really invite more people to connect with us one-on-one through the different mechanisms, to find us on LinkedIn. And yeah, we're really excited to collaborate more and share more about our form of lifespan navigation, which is the category of advocacy work that we do.
Yeah, it's great. And you guys have been great partners. So delighted. Thank you so much for preparing and delivering that wonderful workshop. And we're going to wrap up. before we get to our concluding session, which is in just 10 minutes, so pretty quick. Concluding session wrap up, what's next, and our virtual toast. And you probably saw that I have a very large glass of wine in this beautiful NAC glass that if you purchased an experience box, which we still have a few left, please grab that, because we're going to hear from Carrie Kempton, who is the president of NAC, who's going to give us the virtual toast at the end of this next session. And we'll see you in about 10 minutes. See ya.